He built an empire on fear, buried the only woman he ever loved, and told himself it was necessary. He was wrong about all of it. If you've ever watched someone throw away the one thing that actually mattered, keep watching. This story will cut you somewhere real. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this reaches. Now let's begin. Roman DeLuca had attended 43 weddings in his life. He had stood at the edges of dance floors in cities from Chicago to Naples, watching alliances form over champagne and handshakes, watching men smile at each other while calculating debts and leverage in the backs of their minds. He understood weddings the way he understood everything, as theater. Elaborate, expensive theater where the audience was also the cast, and the stakes beneath the silk and flowers were never romantic. He didn't expect tonight to be different. The Marchetti wedding was being held at the Drexel Grand, a building that had once been a train station and had since been gutted and gilded into something obscene. The ceilings were 40 feet high. The chandeliers alone cost more than most people earned in a decade. White roses lined every surface in arrangement so perfect they looked artificial, and maybe they were. Roman couldn't tell anymore in rooms like this what was real and what was constructed specifically to look that way. He arrived 11 minutes late, which was intentional. He moved through the crowd the way he always did, slow and deliberate, speaking when spoken to, never initiating. Men stepped aside when they saw him coming. Women pretended they hadn't been watching him. He accepted a glass of something he wouldn't drink and positioned himself near the east wall where he had a clear line of sight to 3 exits and the main entrance. His consigliere, Marco Vitelli, materialized at his left shoulder the way he always did, quiet and slightly behind. "Benedetto's people are here," Marco said. His voice was low and even. "Corner booth, 6 of them. I see them. They're watching you." "Everyone's watching me." Roman brought the glass up, didn't drink. "That's the point of coming." Marco said nothing else. That was one of the things Roman valued about the man. He understood when a statement was a full stop and not an invitation. The reception was at full noise now. The band played something orchestral and warm, the kind of music designed to make people feel like their lives were cinematic. Waitstaff threaded through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Roman tracked faces. He recognized roughly 2/3 of the room, old money, new money, dirty money, all dressed in the same shade of expensive. The Marchetti patriarch, 72 years old and sharp as a blade behind his soft handshakes, was working the east side of the room with his son-in-law. The Benedetto faction was holding their corner with the careful stillness of men who were pretending to be relaxed. Roman had come because not coming would have communicated something he didn't want communicated. His presence said, "I am not threatened. I am not concerned. Everything is exactly as it should be." It was theater. He was good at theater. He was halfway through his second circuit of the room when the hair on the back of his neck moved. It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't a sound or a word. It was simply a shift in his peripheral vision. A woman moving through the crowd near the champagne tower, her back to him, dark hair pulled up into something simple. She was wearing a deep green dress that didn't try very hard, which meant it didn't need to. She was talking to someone he didn't recognize, laughing at something, and there was a quality to the laugh, the angle of her head, the particular way her shoulders moved, that hit him somewhere below the ribs before his brain had even finished processing what he was seeing. He stopped walking. Marco nearly walked into him from behind. "DeLuca!" Roman didn't hear him. He was watching the woman turn, just a few degrees, just enough for him to catch her profile, and his chest did something complicated and involuntary that he hadn't felt in 5 years. Elena Cross. The name arrived in his mind the way things did when you had spent years deliberately not thinking about them. Fully formed, carrying all its weight at once, hitting harder for having been held back so long. He stood completely still in the middle of the most politically charged room in Chicago and stared at a woman he had spent 5 years pretending was dead to him. She looked different. Not in the ways he would have expected. She hadn't aged into something softer. She'd done the opposite. There was a quality to how she held herself now that hadn't been there before. Composed. Precisely composed, in the way of someone who had learned composure through necessity rather than temperament. She had always been beautiful. That part hadn't changed at all, which was almost offensive. What had changed was that she looked like she didn't need anything from anyone in that room. And 5 years ago, despite everything she'd claimed, he had never entirely believed that about her. He believed it now. Who invited her? He said. It wasn't really a question. It came out flat, in the register he used when he was working to keep his voice neutral. Marco followed his sightline. A beat of silence. Sofia Marchetti's college roommate, he said. They've stayed close. I should have flagged it. You should have. Do you want to leave? Roman didn't answer, which was its own answer. He didn't leave rooms. He didn't rearrange his schedule around the possibility of discomfort. He had built everything he owned on the principle that you did not show weakness, not to your enemies, and not to yourself. And you certainly did not exit a room full of political allies because a woman from your past happened to be standing near the champagne. He was going to cross the room. He was going to speak to her with the same measured calm he brought to every interaction in his professional life. He was going to make it clear, through a few minutes of controlled conversation, that whatever the two of them had once had was exactly as finished as it had been the night she disappeared. He was still deciding exactly how to do that, how much distance to keep, what tone to open with, whether to let her notice him first or approach directly, when the shriek happened. Not a shriek of alarm. Shriek wasn't quite right, actually. It was a sound of pure, uncomplicated delight, the specific sound that only small children make when they are doing exactly what they want to do without a single competing thought in their heads. The crowd parted slightly, that natural human reflex when something small and fast is moving through, and then he felt it. Small arms. Barely any weight to them. Something wrapped around his left leg with extraordinary conviction, tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his slacks, and then a face tipped up toward his with enormous dark eyes and absolutely no hesitation whatsoever. The little girl was maybe 4, maybe 5. Dark hair in 2 uneven braids that suggested someone had done them in a hurry, or she had been pulling at them. A dress that was white with a pale yellow ribbon around the waist, now slightly wrinkled. A small smear of what looked like buttercream frosting on her left cheek. She was looking up at him with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated joy. "Daddy!" she shouted. The word hit the room like a stone hitting still water. Roman felt it ripple out, the conversations nearest him dropping first, then the ones further, a cascading silence spreading outward from where he stood, until the band was the only sound left, and then even the band seemed to falter, and then there was nothing. Just 40 or 50 people in formal wear staring at the feared head of the DeLuca organization, while a small child clung to his leg and beamed up at him with his own eyes. He was certain of it the moment he saw them, his own eyes looking back at him, dark, slightly tilted at the corners, with the same quality of steadiness that people who didn't know him well often mistook for coldness. He had never been so still in his life. He was a man who prided himself on reading every room, anticipating every shift in dynamics, staying precisely 3 steps ahead of every situation. He had survived things that should have killed him. He had made decisions in seconds that other men agonized over for weeks. He had built an organization through force of will and absolute control, and an unflinching ability to see reality without flinching from it. He looked down at the little girl holding his leg and felt every circuit in his mind go completely silent. "Lily." A woman's voice from his right, low, tight with something that was trying very hard not to be panic. "Lily, come here." Roman raised his eyes. Elena Cross was standing 6 feet away, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Fear, yes, but underneath the fear something harder and more complicated. Fury, maybe. Or grief. Or both at once, fighting each other behind her eyes. She looked like she might be sick. She looked like she might run. She looked like she was doing everything in her power not to do either. "Lily," she said again, softer this time. She crouched down slightly, extending her hand. "Come to Mama, sweetheart." The little girl, Lily, turned her head toward her mother with the unhurried confidence of a child who does not yet understand urgency. Then she turned back to Roman and tightened her grip on his leg. "I found Daddy," she announced, to no one in particular, to everyone in general. Her voice was clear and bright in the massive silence of the room. She said it the way children say things that seem to them self-evident and barely worth mentioning. Roman had exactly one coherent thought. He thought, "She has my eyes." Then the ballroom erupted. It wasn't chaos. Not the kind of chaos Roman was used to, which involved guns or the threat of them. This was social chaos. The particular maelstrom of 40 powerful people all recalibrating simultaneously, whispers, igniting whispers, hands finding the arms of whoever was standing nearby. He caught fragments. DeLuca. Child. Is she? Did you see? Whose is she? Look at the eyes. He was aware of all of it and registering none of it because he was still looking at Elena. She had straightened. She was very controlled now, very still, the way people get when they have decided that stillness is the only shield available. She had placed herself close enough to Lily that she could reach the child in one step, but she hadn't grabbed her yet. Maybe she understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that grabbing Lily and running would be the worst possible move in a room full of people who were already calculating what this moment meant. Roman unclenched his jaw. He reached down, very slowly, and touched the top of Lily's head. Just briefly, just a single brush of his hand across those dark, uneven braids. And then he looked at Elena and said, very quietly, "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about." The automatic answer, the prepared answer. She had been rehearsing some version of that sentence for years, maybe, kept it sharpened and ready. Her voice was even. Her voice was impressive. "Elena." Something moved across her face. Just a flicker, gone before he could name it. "Not here," she said. "Agreed." He straightened, and because he knew the room was watching and he had not survived 43 years by ignoring rooms, he allowed his expression to settle into something neutral and authoritative. He looked at Marco, a single glance that carried complete instructions. Marco nodded fractionally and began moving to create space, redirecting the nearest clusters of guests with the smooth professionalism that Roman paid him exceptionally well to maintain. Lily was still attached to his leg. Roman looked down at her again. She looked up at him. There was zero fear in her face, zero uncertainty. She had the absolute confidence of someone who has decided something and sees no reason to revise the decision. It was, he realized with a feeling he could not entirely name, extremely familiar. He had been told his whole life that he possessed exactly that quality. He had never before seen it reflected back at him from outside himself. "What's your name?" he said. He kept his voice neutral. He didn't know how to speak to a child. He had never needed to. "Lily Elena DeLuca," she said, with great dignity. The room went, if possible, quieter. Roman didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the little girl. He felt Elena go completely rigid in his peripheral vision. "Who told you that name?" he said. "My name," Lily said patiently, as if he had perhaps misunderstood the original question. "Lily." Elena's voice was different now. Something had broken open in it, something careful and controlled giving way. "Come here, baby." She crossed the space between them and took the little girl's hand, and this time Lily went, pressing herself against her mother's side without releasing Elena's fingers. Elena straightened and looked at Roman with an expression that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. It was the expression of a woman who had built something carefully, brick by brick, and was watching it begin to fall. 10 minutes, Roman said. "That's all I'm asking. That's not Elena." He said her name differently this time, dropped the register, dropped the performance. Said it the way he used to say it, before everything, when they were just two people in an apartment on the north side of the city and the world hadn't gotten between them yet. 10 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her count the costs, watched her arrive slowly, at the understanding that there was no version of this moment where she walked away and it stayed walked away from. "Fine," she said. The word came out sharp as a cut. Marco had found them a side room, some kind of event office, fluorescent lighting, a desk with a broken wheel on one of its legs, 2 chairs stacked against the wall. Not the setting Roman would have chosen, but it had a door that closed, and right now a door that closed was everything. Elena set Lily down and knelt in front of her. "Stay by the door for me, okay? Don't go anywhere." "Are you and the man going to argue?" Lily asked. She seemed entirely unbothered by the prospect. Elena made a sound that was almost a laugh and entirely wasn't. "We're going to talk." "Talking is arguing," Lily said, with the authority of someone who had made a scientific observation. "Wait by the door, sweetheart." Lily accepted this with the practical resignation of a child who has learned which requests are negotiable and which aren't. She went to lean against the wall near the door with the patience of someone settling in for a known duration, and she began swinging her feet against the baseboard in a measured rhythm. Roman waited until Elena stood and turned before he spoke. How old is she? Roman, how old? Elena's jaw tightened. 5. She'll be 6 in March. He did the math. He'd been doing it since the ballroom. The timing. Don't. Her voice went hard. Don't start calculating at me like I'm a logistics problem. She is not a logistics problem. I'm not. He stopped, took a breath. He could feel the anger rising, and he had spent 20 years learning how to run it through a channel instead of letting it flood. I'm trying to understand what happened. You know what happened. The words came out clipped, final. She was looking at him the way you look at something that has already been settled and does not require revisiting. I don't, actually. He kept his voice even. 5 years ago you disappeared. No call, no letter, nothing. I had people looking for you for 3 months. Something crossed her face, just a flash. You had people looking for me? Yes. After. After what? She laughed, and it was the worst sound he had ever heard from her, hollow and abraded. Don't do this, Roman. Don't stand in front of me and pretend you don't know what you did. He stared at her. I genuinely don't know what you're talking about. The letter. She said it like the word tasted bad. Your letter, your instructions. You were very clear. You didn't leave any room for ambiguity. I'll give you that. What letter? The silence that followed was different from the one in the ballroom. That had been a silence of shock, ambient and expanding. This silence was dense, specific. Elena was watching him. Something in her expression had shifted, not softened, but recalibrated, the way a compass adjusts when it detects interference. The letter, she said again, but slower this time. The one Marco delivered. Roman went very still. To my apartment, she continued. 3 weeks after you found out I was pregnant. The letter that said you needed to make a choice between me and your position. The letter that said having a family was a liability you couldn't afford and that I should... She stopped. Her voice had developed an edge that wasn't anger. It was something more brittle. That I should handle things accordingly. Roman heard the words. He heard all of them. He was methodical about it. He let them land in sequence, processed the implication of each one, worked the logic forward from premise to conclusion. I never wrote a letter, he said. I saw your signature. Then someone forged it. She looked at him for a long moment, a very long moment. He could see the internal struggle, the part of her that wanted to believe him, and the part of her that had spent 5 years building walls against exactly this, against exactly the version of him that would stand in front of her and say something that would require her to dismantle everything she'd constructed. That's very convenient, she said quietly. Elena, it's convenient, she repeated, that the letter that destroyed everything just happens to be forged, now that you've seen her, now that the room saw you with her. She glanced toward Lily, who was still swinging her feet, apparently absorbed in a private internal calculation of some kind. Don't make her into leverage. Something moved through Roman's chest that was not a feeling he was accustomed to. It wasn't anger. It was closer to vertigo. The particular sensation of standing on ground you believed was solid, and discovering it had been hollow all along. I would never use her, he said. She's... He stopped. The word that arrived in his throat surprised him with its weight. She's mine. She's mine, Elena said, fast and certain. She has always been mine. You made your choice, Roman. 5 years ago, you made it very clear what... I didn't write a letter. He said it with the particular quiet that people who knew him well understood was not a lack of intensity but a concentration of it. I did not write to you. I did not send Marco to your apartment. I did not make a choice because no choice was presented to me. I woke up one morning and you were gone and your phone was disconnected and your landlord said you'd paid out your lease and left. And I spent 3 months having men turn over half of Chicago because I thought something had happened to you. He paused. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly. Something had happened to you. Elena had gone very still. I found out I was pregnant, she said. The words came out careful now, as if she was handling them differently than she had been a minute ago. I told you, that Sunday. You seemed shocked, but I thought... She exhaled. 3 weeks later, Marco knocked on my door with an envelope. Your handwriting on the outside, your signature inside. The letter said you'd consulted with your advisors and that having a child was, it said, operationally untenable. It said if I chose to continue the pregnancy, I would be doing so alone, and that I should not expect any contact from you again. She looked at him steadily. It said if I attempted to contact you, it could create difficulties for both of us. Roman listened to every word. He felt each one as a specific, separate impact. Marco. The name settled in the back of his mind with a weight he didn't fully examine yet. Did you keep it? He said. The letter? Yes. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away toward Lily, who had discovered a small piece of tape on the baseboard and was carefully peeling it back with enormous concentration. Yes, Elena said. I kept it. They stayed in the side room for 40 minutes, not the 10 either of them had agreed to. Lily fell asleep in the chair against the wall with the boneless ease of a child who has reached her limit and simply folded, Elena's jacket draped over her small face utterly unguarded in sleep. She breathed quietly. Roman found himself looking at her more than was perhaps rational. The uneven braids, the frosting still on her cheek that no one had wiped away, the dark lashes against her skin. He had a daughter. He turned the thought over like a stone, looking at all sides of it. He kept expecting the idea to become less enormous the more times he considered it, the way most large things eventually became manageable through repeated exposure. It wasn't. The thought remained exactly as large as the first moment it had arrived. Elena had told him the shape of the last 5 years. Not everything. She was careful about what she gave him, and he understood that, didn't push. But enough. She had gone to her aunt in Columbus first, then Portland, then eventually settled in a smaller city where nobody knew her name and nobody knew who Lily's father was, and they had built something quiet and real. She had a job she was good at. Lily was in kindergarten and was, by every account, both very social and extremely bossy. Elena said the bossiness with a flicker of something that might have been pride under different circumstances. She had not cried once during any of it. He noticed that. Neither had he. He was aware of the effort it cost them both. I want to see the letter, he said when she'd finished. Why? Because if it's forged, there are ways to verify that. She was quiet for a moment. And if it's verified, what does that change? He looked at her steadily. Everything. It doesn't unlose 5 years, Roman. No. He didn't look away. It doesn't. The silence stretched. Lily made a small sound in her sleep and they both looked at her involuntarily, the same instinctive movement, and for a second, less than a second, their eyes met in the aftermath of it, and something between them shifted in a way neither of them acknowledged. Elena looked away first. I need to get her home. She's going to be completely impossible tomorrow if she stays up any later. I know, Roman said, though he didn't know. He knew nothing about what a 5-year-old needed or what impossible meant in the context of a child's mourning. He was aware of the full depth of that not knowing in a way he hadn't expected to be. I'm not asking you for anything, Elena said. She was gathering her jacket, the one that wasn't currently functioning as Lily's blanket, and her small bag, preparing herself for the logistics of moving a sleeping child. I want that to be clear. I came tonight for Sophia's wedding, not for... She gestured vaguely at the space between them. This. I know that. I'm not looking for anything from you. I know that too. He stood. Elena. She stopped. I want to see her again. I'm not asking for anything complicated. I'm asking for the chance to... He found the end of the sentence harder than he expected. To know her. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing something complex and unresolved. I'll think about it, she said finally. The words were careful. Not a yes, not a no. Something in between, left deliberately open. She lifted Lily with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years, the little girl barely stirring, resettling against Elena's shoulder with a small, exhaled breath. For a second she was close enough to him that he could have touched them both. He didn't. The letter, he said quietly. I need to see it. She paused at the door. Her back was to him. He watched her breathe, just once, deliberately. I'll find it, she said. Then she pushed through the door and was gone, and Roman stood alone in the fluorescent hum of the office with Lily's small shoe. It had fallen off sometime during the last hour, sitting on the floor near the chair. He stood there for a long moment. Then he picked up the shoe, turned it over in his hands once, set it carefully on the desk. He walked back out into the corridor, and almost immediately Marco was at his shoulder. "How bad?" Marco said. Roman didn't answer right away. He was looking down the corridor toward where Elena had gone, already out of sight. He was replaying a specific word she had said. Marco. Marco delivered the letter. He had known Marco Vitelli for 11 years. He had trusted the man with things he trusted no one else with. Marco was the one who had managed the search when Elena disappeared. Marco was the one who had assured him, at the end of 3 months, that she was simply gone, that she had chosen to leave, that there was nothing more to be done. Marco was the one who had delivered a letter that Roman had never written. He turned and looked at the man standing at his shoulder. Marco's face was composed, professionally blank, the face of a man who had decades of practice at being unreadable. But something shifted when Roman looked at him directly, something almost microscopic, a tightening around the eyes. It was there and then it wasn't, too fast to be certain of. But Roman had built his entire career on reading rooms and reading faces, and he had been reading Marco's face for 11 years, and he knew, with a certainty that dropped through him cold and absolute, that the man standing at his shoulder knew exactly what had happened in that ballroom tonight, had maybe always known what would happen when those two particular people ended up in the same room, had possibly arranged it. "Get the car," Roman said. "Of course." Marco turned smoothly. "Should I—" "And then," Roman said very quietly, "I'm going to need you to explain something to me." Marco went absolutely still. It only lasted a moment. Then he turned back, and his face had resettled into its professional blankness, and he said, "Of course," again, as if nothing had happened. But Roman had seen the stillness, and Marco knew he had seen it. They walked toward the exit together, the way they had walked together in 100 rooms over 11 years, and the silence between them was different than it had ever been before. Heavy with something that had no name yet, but would have one soon, something that had been waiting, patient as stone, for exactly this moment to break open into the air between them. Outside, the Chicago night was cold and clear. Roman got into the car. He sat in the dark and felt the weight of what the evening had dropped on him. A daughter, a betrayal, 5 years, all of it arriving at once. And he sat with it without flinching because that was what he did. He looked at difficult things directly. He had always done that. It was possibly the only thing about himself he was entirely certain was a strength rather than a liability. He had a daughter with his eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and an old shoe left behind in a fluorescent-lit room. And somewhere in his own organization, there was a man who had decided, 11 years in, that Roman DeLuca could be managed, that the empire could be steered by controlling what its head was allowed to know, that you could forge a man's handwriting and break his life apart and bury the pieces, and as long as you were close enough to control the search, nothing would ever surface. The car moved through the Chicago streets. Roman looked out the window and said nothing. He was going to find the letter. He was going to find every piece of it, every forged signature, every intercepted message, every staged disappearance. And when he had found all of it, when he had the whole shape of the thing laid out in front of him, he was going to make a decision about Marco Vitelli that Marco was not going to walk away from. But first he needed to find out whether Elena still had that envelope, the one with his handwriting on the outside. Because Marco was careful. Marco had always been careful. But careful men still made mistakes, and the mistake Marcus had made was that he'd put Roman's name on the outside of the envelope in order to make it convincing. And Roman had a very specific way of writing the letter L in his surname. He had never taught that habit to anyone. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. An unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered. Nothing, just breathing, and then, very soft, so soft he almost missed it under the noise of the city. A child's voice. Half asleep, still not fully sure of where she was. "Daddy?" The call ended. Roman sat in the dark with his phone in his hand. It took him 11 seconds to understand what it meant. That Elena's phone had been in her jacket pocket, that Lily had apparently woken and found it, and called the last number in the recent call log, which was Roman's, which meant Elena had saved his number, which meant at some point in the last hour she had... His phone buzzed again. Elena this time. He answered immediately. "I'm so sorry," she said, slightly breathless. "She got into my phone. It's fine." His voice came out different than he expected. Lower. Something in it he hadn't planned. A silence. She wants to know, Elena said, very carefully, if she can see you again. Roman looked out at the Chicago skyline. The lights of the city blurred slightly through the car window. I'll be wherever she wants, he said. Another silence. Longer. Roman. Elena's voice had changed. Something underneath the composure, something cracking slightly at the edge. There are people who know what happened tonight, people who were in that room. He understood what she was saying. He understood it exactly. I know, he said. That means, I know what it means. He kept his voice steady. Elena, listen to me very carefully. I need you to go somewhere tonight that isn't your hotel. Silence. How bad is it going to get? She said quietly. He thought about Marco's face in the corridor, the stillness, the one fractional moment of something that was almost, but not quite, fear. I thought about the fact that by now, the news of what had happened in the Marchetti ballroom would have reached every family that had a representative in that room, which was most of them, and that by morning the entire landscape of what people believed about the DeLuca Empire would have shifted, because the DeLuca Empire had just revealed that it had an heir that it hadn't known about, which meant a vulnerability, which meant opportunity, which meant, go somewhere safe, he said. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He heard her exhale. Okay, she said. The line stayed open. Neither of them ended the call. Through the static, he could hear, distantly, the sound of Lily asking her mother something in a sleepy voice. He couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter, just the sound of it, small, ordinary, entirely unconscious of the storm that had broken loose around it, hit him somewhere he hadn't planned on. He had a daughter, and someone in his organization had spent 5 years making sure he didn't know it. By morning, one of those two facts was going to cost somebody everything. Roman told the driver to take the long route. Not because he needed the time, he knew exactly where he was going and what he was going to do when he got there. But because the car was the only place in the world right now where no one could see his face, and he needed 60 seconds where no one was watching him process anything. He got 40 before his phone went off again. Not Elena, not Marco. One of his lieutenants, a man named Caruso, who ran the South Side operation and who only called at this hour when something had already gone wrong, rather than when something was about to. Roman answered. Talk. Words out. Caruso's voice had the specific texture of someone who had been awake too long and was trying to sound like he hadn't been. 3 families that had people at the Marchetti event. Benedetto called his underboss 20 minutes ago. We picked it up on the monitor. What did he say? A pause. He said, DeLuca has a kid he didn't know about. And then he said, and I'm quoting exactly here, find out everything about the mother. Roman's jaw tightened. He looked out the window. The city moved past him, indifferent and illuminated. Pull our people off the Benedetto debt collection, he said. I want them on Elena Cross instead. Every entrance to wherever she's staying. I'll text you the address in 10 minutes. How many? Enough that nobody breathes near her without us knowing about it. He paused. And Caruso. Nobody touches Marco Vitelli tonight. Silence on the line. Boss? Nobody touches him. He goes home, he stays there, and I want 2 men watching the building. But nobody touches him until I say so. Understood. Roman ended the call. He texted Elena a question. Where are you staying? The reply came back in under a minute, which meant she'd been holding her phone. He texted the address to Caruso, and then sat with the phone in his hand and thought about Marco for exactly 30 seconds before he put the thought away. There was an order to things. There had to be. You couldn't let the anger drive the sequence. The hotel was a mid-range place in River North, the kind with a lobby that tried a little too hard, and hallways that smelled like industrial cleaning product. Roman took the elevator to the 4th floor with one of his security men, Nico, and knocked twice on the door of room 412. Elena opened it with the chain still on, just the one vertical slice of her face visible, the eye, the set of her mouth. You brought someone, she said. He's staying in the hall. She looked at Nico. Nico looked at the wall in the practiced way of men who understand that their job is sometimes to be architectural. The chain came off. Elena stepped back to let Roman in. The room was what it was. 2 beds, a narrow window, a desk with a luggage rack and her suitcase half open on it. Lily was in the far bed, fully asleep this time, no coat needed, her dark hair spread sideways across the pillow. Someone had wiped the frosting off her cheek. Small mercies. Roman stood inside the door and let his eyes adjust. Elena had changed out of the green dress. She was in dark jeans and a plain shirt now, her hair down, and somehow this made her look both more like herself and harder to look at directly. "How bad is it?" she said. Same question she'd asked on the phone. "Benedetto already knows," he said. "He's looking into you." She absorbed this without visible reaction. "Benedetto? He's one of 3 families I know about. There are probably more. Because of tonight. Because Lily called me daddy in front of 50 people, half of whom have been waiting for a crack in my wall for a decade." He kept his voice flat. Not accusatory, just accurate. "I'm not blaming her. I'm not blaming you. I'm telling you what the landscape looks like." Elena sat on the edge of the closer bed. She didn't look afraid, which was either impressive or concerning. He couldn't tell which yet. She looked tired in a very specific way, the way people look when they've been braced for something for a long time, and the something has finally arrived and the tension of waiting is gone, but the cost of it isn't. "What do you need from me?" she said. "The letter." "Now?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and went to her suitcase, and he watched her move aside 2 folded shirts and reach into the inner pocket. Not something casual, something intentional, something she'd been carrying specifically. And she turned back with a plain white envelope in her hand. It had been opened carefully and resealed at some point. The envelope itself was soft at the folds from handling. She held it out to him. Roman took it. He didn't open it yet. He turned it over in his hands first, looking at the outside. His name was on the back flap. Not the address, just his name. Handwritten. The L in DeLuca had a small serif kick at the bottom of the vertical stroke, a habit his 3rd-grade teacher had beaten into him and that he'd never shaken. He had never taught that to anyone. Marco wrote neat architectural print, no serifs. Roman had seen his handwriting on documents and orders for 11 years. He opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on his personal stationery, cream, heavy stock, with a faint watermark he recognized. Not something you could get at a print shop, something you'd have to lift from his desk. The signature at the bottom was good. It was very good. Whoever had done it had studied his signature enough to get the particular way he crossed the capital R. He read it twice. He read it the way he'd been trained to read things. Not for the emotional content first, but for the details, the specific phrasing, the choices of language. When he got to the phrase operationally untenable, he stopped. He'd heard those words recently. Last month, in a meeting about a shipment problem in Detroit. Marco had used that phrase. Roman had noted it because it was the kind of clinical language that didn't fit the conversation, and he'd meant to think about it afterward and hadn't. He refiled that now. "The stationery came from my office," he said. Elena was watching him read. "I know. Which means whoever wrote this had access to my desk. That's—" He stopped himself. He refolded the letter. He placed it back in the envelope with the particular care of someone preserving evidence. "It was Marco. You said that tonight. I'm more certain now." He held up the envelope. "This phrasing, the L in the name, the stationery." He set the envelope down on the desk beside him. "I need to know if there's more. Did he contact you again after this? Any other letters? Any messages?" "No." She shook her head. "After that I was gone within the week. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't want to be found." The word found landed between them with a weight neither of them commented on directly. "Why would he do it?" Elena said. It wasn't a question she expected him to answer. He could hear that. It was the kind of thing you say when you've been carrying the question for a long time and saying it out loud is part of carrying it. Roman answered anyway. "Power." He said it simply. "I was getting—" He paused. This was harder to say than he expected. Not because it was complicated, but because saying it required a kind of admission about what he'd had back then. "I was getting distracted. From the work. From the organization. You were the distraction." She looked at him. "I mean that as a factual description," he said, "not a criticism." "I know," she said quietly. "Marco would have seen it. He would have watched me start to split my attention between the organization and—" He stopped. And you. And a man like Marco, who has spent 11 years positioning himself as indispensable, would have run the math and concluded that if I chose you, if I stepped back from certain operations, if I became a man with a family and a reason to be careful, his influence diminishes. He needed me hungry. He looked at her steadily. He needed me alone. Elena sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet. Lily breathed in the way of children deeply asleep, even and slow. He watched you look for me, Elena said. He managed the search. He knew exactly where I was. Probably from the first month. She made a sound that wasn't quite anything. Not anger, not grief. A sound that existed somewhere between the two where language hadn't been invented yet. She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose and stayed like that for a moment. And Roman did not fill the silence because it wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. 5 years, she said finally. I know. She doesn't know who you are. She saw you and called you daddy because... Elena's voice thinned. She pushed through it. Because I told her she had a father. I didn't tell her your name. I didn't describe you. She's 5 and she made a decision the moment she saw you, and I couldn't... She stopped. I couldn't understand how she knew. Roman thought about Lily's face looking up at him in the ballroom, the absolute certainty of it, the no hesitation. She knew, he said. Elena looked at him. Her eyes were very bright, which meant she was working very hard to keep them from being something else. I'm not going to let anything happen to her, Roman said. I know you believe that. Elena. I know you believe it, she repeated. That doesn't make it not terrifying. He had no argument for that. He stood still and let it be true. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Caruso. He held up one finger to Elena and answered. We have a problem, Caruso said. One of the men I posted outside. He spotted something. Blue sedan, no plates, sitting at the end of the block. Roman's body shifted into a different register without him deciding to. Shoulders down, breathing adjusted, the particular settled quality of a man who has stopped thinking about feelings because something else requires his full attention. How long? Roman said. 40 minutes at least. Could be there before we were. Anyone in it? 2, sitting, not talking. Pull the man back from outside position, put him in the stairwell on the 4th floor. Don't let them know we've seen them. And the sedan? Leave it for now. Roman was already looking around the room, recalculating. I want to know who they belong to before we move on them. He ended the call. Elena was watching him. She had that quality again. The composure of someone who has learned to read bad news from the change in a room rather than waiting to be told. We need to move, he said. She stood immediately. No questions, no argument. She crossed to the far bed and put her hand on Lily's shoulder, gentle but deliberate. Lily, baby, wake up. Lily surfaced from sleep the way children do. Not gradually, but all at once, eyes opening with complete consciousness, looking at her mother and then past her mother to where Roman was standing by the desk. The man is still here, she said, with the mild interest of a child noting a return. We're going to go somewhere else, Elena said. Can you put your shoes on for me? Lily considered this request with brief seriousness, then sat up and reached for her shoes at the end of the bed. She looked at Roman while she put them on. Her regard was completely direct, completely unself-conscious, the way children look at things they're genuinely interested in. You smell like outside, she said. Roman had absolutely no idea how to respond to that. I was outside, he said. We're going back outside? Yes. Okay, she said, with the tone of someone who has filed this information and found it acceptable. Elena had her bag packed in under 3 minutes. Roman watched and catalogued. She was fast and she was efficient, and she didn't ask him to carry anything, which he found himself noting in a way he couldn't have explained. She lifted Lily with one arm, suitcase handle in the other hand, and looked at him with a question that didn't need words. He opened the door. Nico straight in the hallway. Roman looked at him. Stairwell, not the elevator. They moved. The next hour was logistics. Roman was good at logistics. It was the substrate of everything he did, the part that nobody saw and that made everything else possible. He had Caruso arrange a car to meet them at the service exit. He had 2 additional men position themselves between the hotel and the street. He had the sedan documented, color, make, a partial description of the occupants from Caruso's man, and sent it to someone who could cross-reference it against known vehicles associated with the Benedetto organization. Lily fell back asleep in the car with the absolute trust of a small person who has decided the situation is being handled. She was curled against Elena's side, one hand fisted in Elena's sleeve. Elena sat very straight with her eyes forward and her jaw set, and Roman sat in the front and did not look at either of them too often, because something about the sight of them together in his peripheral vision was doing something to his chest that he didn't have the architecture to process right now. He took them to one of his properties, a residential building on the near north side that no one connected to him directly, held through a third-party LLC that Marco didn't know about. One of the few organizational details Roman had deliberately kept to himself over the years for exactly this category of situation. The apartment on the 6th floor was clean, stocked, and unremarkable. It had a second bedroom. It had 3 exits from the building. Elena stood in the kitchen and looked around at the clean surfaces and the ordinary furniture with an expression he couldn't read. "Whose place is this?" she said. "Mine. Technically. Technically." "Nobody knows about it." He paused. "Nobody who matters." She looked at him. There was something working behind her eyes that she wasn't going to say yet. He could wait. "Lily can take the bedroom," he said. "There's a couch in—" "I'm not taking your bedroom." "I'm not staying." Silence. "I have things to deal with tonight," he said. "I'll be back in the morning." Elena set her bag down on the kitchen counter slowly. She looked at it instead of at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to Marco." She was quiet for a moment. "Talk." "I'm going to find out what he knows and how far the damage goes." "And then?" He didn't answer. "Roman." She looked up. "I need you to be alive. She needs—" Elena stopped, rearranged herself. "Lily needs you to be alive, if that's something that factors into what you're deciding tonight." Something moved through him that he didn't name. He looked at her steadily. "It factors in," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away first again. Same as the ballroom. He noticed she kept doing that, kept being the one to look away, and he wondered if she was aware of it. "There's food in the refrigerator," he said. "Nico will be in the hallway. Call me for anything." He moved toward the door. He had his hand on the frame when she said his name, just once. Quiet. He turned. Elena was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, not defensively, but like she was holding something together from the inside. She looked at him with the full weight of 5 years and everything in them. "If you'd gotten the letter," she said, "if Marco hadn't—" She stopped, tried again. "Would you have chosen differently?" The question landed in the center of the room and sat there. Roman had built his entire adult life on not making promises he wasn't certain he could keep. He had never told someone what they wanted to hear if he didn't believe it. It was possibly the only form of honesty he'd been consistent about. He looked at Elena Cross standing in a borrowed kitchen with his daughter asleep in the next room. "Yes," he said. He said it without hesitation. He said it the way he said things he knew to be true. Her face did something complicated and private that she didn't let him see the end of. He didn't push. He turned and went out the door and pulled it closed behind him with a quiet click that felt, in the silence of the corridor, like the end of something and the beginning of something else at exactly the same time. Marco lived in Lincoln Park, in a townhouse that cost more than a man of his official salary could afford, which was a detail Roman had always noticed and chosen not to examine. He was examining it now. He told Caruso to wait in the car. He went to the door alone. He rang the bell. He could hear Marco inside before the door opened. The particular sound of a man who had been awake, who had been waiting, who had heard the car pull up. Roman registered all of it, the delay that was 2 seconds too long, the quality of the silence before the handle turned. Marco opened the door in a robe, which was the choice of a man trying to perform normalcy. His face was composed. His eyes clocked Roman and then moved past him to the empty front step, and something in his expression made a micro-adjustment that Roman filed without comment. "Roman," his voice was steady. "It's past midnight." "I know what time it is." Roman looked at him. He didn't move toward the door, didn't ask to be let in. He stood on the front step and looked at Marco with the particular quality of attention that Marco had watched him direct at other people for 11 years and had never had directed at himself. "Tell me about the letter." A pause. Very small. Very controlled. What letter? The one you delivered to Elena Cross 5 years ago. Roman's voice was even. The one written on my stationery with my signature. Marco's face did not move. His breathing stayed measured. He was good. He had always been good. That was why Roman had trusted him. I don't know what you're talking about, Marco said. You're lying, Roman said with no particular heat. I think the events of tonight have been… You went to her apartment, Roman said. You told her I'd chosen the organization over her and the child. You forged a letter on my stationery, and you signed my name to it, and you delivered it personally so she would believe it. And then you managed the search for 3 months so I'd believe she was just gone. He paused. I want to know why. Marco was looking at him with an expression Roman had never seen on him before. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Something more calculated than fear. A man doing real-time math on outcomes. You were losing focus, Marco said finally. And there it was. Not a denial anymore. Something else. Something that had decided that the denial was finished and moved past it with the adaptability of a man who had been in difficult rooms before. You know what you were like that year. She had gotten into you. You were making decisions based on, she was mine. Roman said it quietly, the way he'd said it in the hotel room. It carried the same weight. She was a vulnerability. Marco's voice developed an edge now, the edge of a man who has decided that if he's past denying, he might as well mean it. I did what I did to protect what we built, what you built. You would have thrown all of it away for a woman who… I had a daughter. The words came out with a force that surprised even Roman. He heard it in his own voice. Something that had no professional name, something raw and territorial and more primitive than anything he kept polished. I had a daughter, and you made sure I didn't know. Marco's face changed, just slightly. The calculation shifted. That was unfortunate, Marco said. Roman looked at him for a long moment. Unfortunate, he said. I didn't know she was pregnant when… But you found out. Roman watched his face. Watched Marco understand that Roman had already mapped the full sequence. You managed the search. You knew where she was within weeks. You knew about Lily. Marco said nothing. You let me spend 5 years, Roman said, not knowing. The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. You want to know what I'm going to do, Roman said. You've been calculating it since you heard the car outside. Roman, I'm going to let you sleep tonight. He stepped back from the door, one step, controlled. I'm going to let you think you have until morning to figure out your options. And then I'm going to pull every document, every communication, every piece of evidence that connects you to what you did, and I'm going to bring it out in the open in front of every family that had a representative in the Marchetti ballroom tonight. Not because I want you destroyed, he paused, because I want them to see what you are. Marco was very still. And the girl? Marco said quietly. Once they know she exists, there are people in those families who will see her the same way I did, as a liability. They'll see her, Roman said, as an heir. That's the difference between how you think and how I think. He held Marco's gaze. Lock your door tonight, Marco. Don't go anywhere, and understand that the only reason you're sleeping in your own bed and not in the ground is that I need what you know before I'm done with you. He turned and walked back toward the car. Behind him, he heard Marco's door close. He heard the lock turn. Roman got into the car and sat for a moment and said nothing. Boss, Caruso said from the front, drive. Where? Roman thought about Elena in the borrowed kitchen, Lily asleep with her dark hair across the pillow, the letter with its forged L sitting in an envelope on the desk. He thought about Marco's face when he said the word unfortunate. Benedetto sent people to the hotel tonight, Roman said. That means he moved within an hour of hearing what happened in the ballroom. He looked out the window at the dark Lincoln Park street. Someone told him where she was staying before I did. Caruso went very still in the driver's seat. Which means, Roman said, that Marco made a phone call between the time I told him to get the car and the time we arrived at the Drexel Grand's exit. He turned to look at Caruso directly. Which means Benedetto and Marco have been in contact, which means Marco built against me. He didn't build it alone. The car was silent. There's a meeting tomorrow, Roman said. 10 in the morning at the warehouse on Fulton. Every lieutenant I have. I want all of them there. He paused. Including the ones who've been at that table long enough that they think their seat is guaranteed. That's going to... Caruso stopped himself. I know what it's going to do, Roman said. Do it. The car pulled away from the curb. Roman looked at his phone. No messages from Elena. He took that as good news and told himself to keep taking it that way until he had reason not to. Somewhere across the city, Marco Vitelli was standing in his own kitchen at midnight making calculations. Somewhere slightly further, in a blue sedan with no plates, two men who'd been watching a hotel were now reporting back to whoever had sent them. And somewhere in a residential building on the near north side, a little girl was asleep with complete confidence in the safety of the world around her. And Roman De Luca had become, without planning it, the man responsible for making sure that confidence was not misplaced. He had been many things in his life. He had been feared and useful and ruthless and occasionally merciful and always, always careful. He had never been a father. He was going to have to learn fast because by the time the sun came up, the fact of his daughter's existence would be in the ears of every significant player in the Chicago underworld. And there were men in those circles who would look at a 5-year-old girl and see nothing but an opportunity to bring Roman De Luca to his knees. His phone lit up. Caruso's contact, the one running plates. The blue sedan was registered to a shell company. The shell company traced back through 2 layers of incorporation to a name Roman recognized. Not Benedetto, someone else entirely, someone who had been at the Marchetti wedding, someone who had smiled at Roman across the room and raised a glass, and who Roman had filed under neutral and moved on. He stared at the name on the screen. The chessboard had just gotten significantly larger. The name on the screen was Vincent Carrera. Roman sat with his phone and looked at it and did not move for a full 10 seconds, which was 9 seconds longer than he typically needed to process information. Vincent Carrera was 61 years old. He ran import logistics out of the port of Milwaukee and had been doing so for 23 years without significant incident. He was not a boss. He was not an underboss. I was the kind of man who sat at the edge of the table at events like the Marchetti wedding and who people greeted warmly because he was useful and dismissed quickly because he wasn't dangerous. Roman had known him for a decade. He had never once put Carrera in a column marked threat. That was the point, he realized. That had always been the point. He told Caruso to find out everything about Carrera's movements in the last 72 hours and sent a second message to a contact who tracked financial flows in the port system. Then he told the driver to take him back to the Fulton Street warehouse, because sleep was not something that was going to happen tonight, and there was work that needed doing in the hours before the morning meeting. He did not let himself think about Elena. He did not let himself think about Lily. He put them both in a part of his mind that he locked from the inside and he focused on the sequence. This was how he had survived for 15 years. Compartment, lock, move. The warehouse on Fulton had served as a secondary operations center for 6 years. It was a building that looked exactly like what it was from the outside. A light industrial space, loading bays, a corrugated roof that rattled in wind, and was something considerably different on the inside. Roman arrived at 2 in the morning and spent 4 hours at a table covered in documents. By 6 a.m., he had 3 things he hadn't had at midnight. The first was a complete communication record between Marco Vitelli and Vincent Carrera going back 14 months, pulled from a monitoring system that Marco had never known existed. The contact volume alone was damning. Men in their respective positions had no operational reason to be in regular contact. The content made it definitive. Supply chain language used as cover. References to a timeline. References to a transition that made Roman's jaw set and stay set. The second was a financial trail. Carrera had been quietly accumulating leverage over 3 of Roman's lieutenants through a combination of debt and favors, all of it structured so that the obligation pointed sideways instead of up, so that none of the 3 men would have necessarily identified Carrera as their creditor. It was patient work. It was the work of someone who had been building something for a very long time. The third was a location. One of Caruso's contacts had tracked the blue sedan after it left the hotel. It had gone to a property in Bridgeport, a former machine shop that Carrera held through the same category of layered shell company that he'd used for the car registration. Roman's people had put eyes on it by 4 a.m. There were 6 men inside. They had equipment that wasn't consistent with a machine shop. Roman looked at all 3 things together and saw the shape of what had been built around him. Marco was the inside piece. Carrera was the outside piece. The debt leverage on the lieutenants was insurance against the possibility that Roman would survive long enough to call a meeting. The location in Bridgeport was the operational center, which meant it was where the documentation lived. Forged communications, fabricated evidence, the full architecture of the manipulation that had been run on both him and Elena 5 years ago, and that had apparently continued to develop since. He needed that building. He needed what was inside it before anyone in that building knew he'd found it. He had 4 hours before the morning meeting. He called Elena at 7. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. "Everything okay?" he said. "Define okay." Her voice had the particular texture of someone who had been awake for most of the night but wasn't going to acknowledge it. "Lily's fine. She ate cereal. She wants to know if you're coming back." Something moved in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. "Tell her yes." A pause on the line. "Roman, what's happening?" "I know who the second player is, beyond Marco." "Who?" "His name is Carrera. You don't know him. He was careful about that. He was the one who built the framework 5 years ago. Marco was the executor. Carrera was the architect." He paused. "I'm going after the documentation this morning. The physical evidence. If I can pull it before he knows I've found the location, I have everything I need for tonight." "What happens tonight?" "I'm calling a full meeting of all the families. Not my lieutenants. The families. All of them." He heard how it sounded. He let it sound like that. "I'm going to put everything on the table in front of all of them at once. Carrera has been cultivating relationships across multiple organizations. If I move on him privately, those relationships protect him. If I expose him publicly, in a room where everyone can see the evidence at the same time, there's nowhere for the protection to come from." Silence on Elena's end. He could hear her breathing. He could hear Lily somewhere in the background, talking to herself with the cheerful self-sufficiency of small children. "That's a lot of things that have to go right," Elena said. "I know. And between now and tonight, stay in the apartment. Don't open the door for anyone except Nico. I'll be back before the meeting." "Roman." Her voice changed. Not softer exactly, stripped of something. The protective layer of composure she'd been maintaining. "Be careful. I'm serious. She knows who you are now. You can't, she's already—" She stopped. "I'll be back," he said. He meant it the way he'd meant yes the night before, without condition. He ended the call and looked at the table of documents for a moment, and then he stood and went to find Caruso. They went to Bridgeport at 8:15 with 6 men, which was fewer than the situation probably warranted and more than Roman preferred. He didn't like large movements. Large movements made noise. The former machine shop sat on a dead-end block between a rail yard and a chain-link fence overgrown with whatever plants could survive Chicago in early spring. The building had 2 visible entry points and one that Roman's people had identified through the overnight surveillance. A loading bay on the north side that was locked from the inside with a padlock that suggested infrequent use. They went in through the north side. The first room was storage. Metal shelving units, packing materials, the residue of the building's former life. 2 men posted here, neither of whom had time to do more than register surprise. Caruso handled both of them with the economy of someone who had done this many times and found no drama in it. The second room was what Roman had come for. It was a working office set up inside what had been the machine shop floor. Portable partitions, folding tables, filing cabinets, 2 laptops running. The man seated at the central table when Roman came through the door was not one of the 6 men his surveillance had counted. He was someone Roman had not expected. He was 29 years old. His name was Danny Fitch, and he had been Roman's personal assistant for 3 years. Danny stood up from the table very fast, the way people stand when their body reacts before their mind has decided what the body should do. His face went through several things in about 2 seconds. Roman watched all of them. "Sit down," Roman said. Danny sat down. Roman looked at the table. The laptops, both open. A printed document he could read from here. A transfer authorization, his signature on it, a signature he had not provided. He looked at Danny. "How long?" Roman said. Danny's mouth moved. Nothing came out. "I'm not going to ask twice," Roman said. His voice was very quiet. It was quieter than it had been with Marco, quieter than it had been with anyone in a long time, and the men with him understood what that particular quiet meant, and gave Roman more space than the room strictly required. 14 months, Danny said. His voice was thin. "They came to me. Carrera came to me. 14 months ago. I owe—" He stopped, swallowed. "I owe money. I owed money. He said he would clear it if I. What did you give them? Access to your calendar, your meeting schedule, advance notice of. Danny's throat worked. Advance notice of operational decisions, not specifics, just timing. Roman was very still. He was doing the math in real time, and the math was changing the shape of everything he'd planned for the morning. 14 months of calendar access, 14 months of advance notice on timing, every meeting he'd called, every movement he'd made, every decision he'd announced to his inner circle before executing, filtered through Danny Fitch to Vincent Carrera. The meeting this morning, Roman said. Fulton Street, 10 o'clock. Danny's face told him before the words did. I sent a message at 6 a.m., Danny said, almost a whisper. Before you... I didn't know you were already there. I sent it on the schedule. I didn't know... Roman turned to Caruso. Get everyone out of Fulton, right now. Caruso already had his phone out. All my lieutenants, Roman said, and now his voice had a different quality. Not quiet anymore, but compressed. The specific sound of a man moving very fast inside a very small space. Every man I called for that meeting has been flagged. Carrera knows I called a full meeting, and he knows who's coming. He looked at Danny. Does he know about the Bridgeport location, that I'm here? Danny shook his head. No. I didn't know you'd found it. I only sent the meeting notification. That's the only thing you've done today. Yes. Roman believed him. Not because Danny was honest, clearly he wasn't, but because the fear on his face had the specific texture of someone who understood exactly how narrow his margin was and was not going to compound it with a lie that could be checked. Secure him, Roman told one of his men. He turned back to the filing cabinets. I need everything in this room. Every document, both laptops, everything in those cabinets. We have 20 minutes before I have to assume Carrera has another line into my operation that I don't know about yet. The men moved. Roman moved with them, pulling drawers, scanning contents, making fast decisions about what was evidence and what was operational material, and what was both. He worked with his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled, and he didn't think about Danny Fitch sitting on a folding chair behind him, because there was no room for that right now. What he was thinking about, what he was unable to stop thinking about, even while his hands moved through files and his eyes processed documents, was the meeting at Fulton Street. Carrera had known about it since 6 a.m. He had 4 hours. That was enough time to make it not a meeting but something else. Roman's 7 lieutenants, converging on a single location at a time their employer's enemy knew in advance. His phone rang. Caruso, from the other side of the partition. Fulton Street, Caruso said when Roman answered. 3 of my men can't reach their assignments, the ones who were supposed to be inside by 9. Roman stopped moving. Since when? He said. Last 30 minutes. All 3 went dark at roughly the same time. Roman set down the file in his hand. He stood very still in the middle of the Bridgeport machine shop, with its partitions and its laptops and its evidence of 14 months of patient architectural destruction, and he felt the sequence click into place with the horrible clarity of something that was already in motion. Carrera wasn't waiting for the meeting. Carrera had started. Money had 4 calls in the next 6 minutes. 2 connected, 2 didn't. The ones that didn't were lieutenants named Briggs and Ferreira, both of whom had been at their assigned positions less than 2 hours ago when Roman's check-in confirmed it. He told Caruso to get the cars. He told the men to bring everything they'd pulled from the machine shop. He told one man to stay with Danny Fitch and another 2 to stay on the building perimeter. Then he went outside into the thin March light and stood on the dead-end Bridgeport block with the rail yard behind him and tried to think past the noise in his head. Carrera had moved first. That was the read. The meeting notification had been the trigger, the signal that Roman was pulling the organization together, which meant Roman was close to having enough to act, which meant Carrera's window was closing, so Carrera had closed it from his end instead. How many men did he have? Roman ran the numbers against what he knew about Carrera's legitimate operation, against what the financial records from inside had suggested, against the 6 men who'd been in this building overnight. Enough was the answer. Enough that a direct confrontation at Fulton Street, on a timeline Carrera had controlled, with 3 of Roman's men already dark, would not have gone well. His phone rang again. Number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. You found this building. The voice was mild, unhurried, the voice of a man in a warm room. You're faster than Marco said you'd be. Vincent Carrera. Roman said nothing. He let the silence work. I have some things you care about, Carrera said. Some things you care about more than others. A pause. One of them just started crying when we picked up the car. I thought you should know she's not hurt. I want you to know that before you make any decisions about how this goes. The dead-end street, the rail yard, the thin March light. He said it again. He said it the way men say things in the moment before the world reshapes itself. If you touch her... I've touched nothing, Carrera said. I've explained to her that everything is fine. She is 5, Mr. DeLuca. I have no interest in frightening a child. A pause. Her mother is also unharmed. I'd like to keep it that way. I think you'd like to keep it that way. Roman's right hand had closed into a fist at some point. He was not aware of having done it. What do you want? He said. Flat. Every syllable controlled. I want to finish the conversation that Marco's incompetence interrupted 5 years ago, Carrera said. The one where you and I negotiate the terms of a transition that should have happened by now. His voice didn't change. It maintained its mildness with the ease of a man who had been patient for a very long time and could afford to remain patient a little longer. There's a building I'd like you to come to, an old cathedral on the southwest side. I'll text you the address. Come with 2 men and no more. Come in the next hour. And if I come with more than 2 men, then the conversation gets significantly shorter and significantly less productive. A pause. For everyone. The call ended. Roman stood on the Bridgeport street and looked at nothing. His fist was still closed. He became aware of it and opened it deliberately, finger by finger, the way his first handler had taught him when he was 19, and learning that rage was only useful when it had somewhere to go. Caruso came out through the loading bay door. He read Roman's face and stopped. What happened? He said. Roman told him. Short, precise, no editorializing. He watched Caruso's expression move through several things and settle on a kind of controlled fury that Roman recognized because he was living in it. How do you want to play it? Caruso said. Roman looked down at his phone. Carrera's text had already arrived. An address on the southwest side. A cathedral that had been deconsecrated and sold and sat vacant because the neighborhood around it had emptied out and no developer had found a reason to want the property yet. Stone walls. 1 main entrance and a handful of secondary ones. Acoustics that would make it easy to hear movement from inside. High windows that let in light but not visibility from street level. Carrera had picked it carefully. Of course he had. Carrera picked everything carefully. I'm going in with 2 men, Roman said. Roman, he has Elena and Lily. He said it once, the way you say facts, not asking for a response to them, just establishing them. I'm going in with 2 men. You're going to take the rest and position them outside every exit of that building before I arrive. Not visible, not anywhere he can see them from inside. He paused. And I need you to pull every piece of documentation from the machine shop into a secure location and make sure it can be sent to every significant family in this city simultaneously if I give the word. Caruso was quiet for a moment. And if you can't give the word? Roman met his eyes. Then you send it anyway. Everything, to all of them, with a message that explains what it is. Caruso nodded, slow, once. How long do I wait before I consider that scenario? Roman checked his watch. It was 8:47 in the morning. 2 hours, he said. If you haven't heard from me by 11, send everything and then make your own decisions. He turned toward the car. His mind was already in the cathedral, already moving through the space, already running the possibilities of what Carrera had arranged inside those stone walls. He thought about Lily crying when they picked up the car. He thought about Elena in whatever room Carrera had put her in, not showing fear because she didn't show fear, keeping herself steady because Lily needed her to be steady. He got in the car. He had roughly 50 minutes before he would be standing inside an abandoned cathedral across from a man who had spent 14 months engineering his destruction, with the 2 people he would die for sitting somewhere nearby as insurance against his better judgment. He had the documentation. He had Caruso outside. He had the specific knowledge, confirmed now in every detail, of exactly what Marco and Carrera had built and how they'd built it. What he did not have was a version of this that ended cleanly. Every scenario he ran in the next 45 minutes as the car moved southwest through the city had a cost. The question was which cost he could live with and which cost he couldn't. By the time the car turned onto the block with the cathedral at the end of it, gray stone, boarded lower windows, a front door that had been recently unboarded and stood slightly open, Roman DeLuca had answered that question. He was not going to negotiate. He was not going to trade anything. I was going to walk through that door and end this one way or another, and the version where Elena and Lily walked out of that building unhurt was the only version he was playing for, and he was going to do whatever the situation required of him to make it the version that happened. He had been many things in 15 years. Some of them he was not proud of. Some of them he had told himself were necessary and had believed it more or less completely. He had never fought for something that mattered the way this mattered. He had never had something to lose that felt like this felt. The car stopped at the curb. Roman checked his weapon, opened the door, and walked toward the cathedral with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who had decided the outcome before he'd arrived and intended to make the world agree with him. The cathedral door was heavier than it looked. Roman pushed it with one hand and felt the resistance of old iron hinges that hadn't been used in years, and then it gave and the smell hit him first. Stone and damp, and something underneath that was older than either. The accumulated cold of a building that had been sealed against weather and humanity for a long time. He went in. Nico and a man named Reyes went in behind him. The door swung shut. The interior was enormous in the specific way of abandoned places, where the absence of furniture and people makes the architecture feel more extreme than it was designed to feel. The nave stretched out ahead of them. Stone floor, high vaulted ceiling, the boarded lower windows creating a half-light that fell from the upper glass in long, pale columns. Pews had been removed at some point, leaving the floor entirely open. Their footsteps echoed. Roman counted exits without appearing to. Main door behind him. 2 side doors, one on each wall, both closed. A door near what had been the altar end, probably to a sacristy or back corridor. 4 points. Carrera had texted the address and told him 2 men and no more, and Carrera was careful, which meant there were men on each of those exits from the inside. He had walked in anyway. He needed to see the room. Carrera was standing at the far end of the nave, near the altar platform. He was a compact man, silver-haired, dressed like he was attending a business lunch. Dark suit, good shoes, the particular grooming of someone who considers his appearance a professional instrument. He had 4 men visible with him. Roman assumed more that weren't visible. Between Carrera and Roman, standing slightly to the left of center in the wide, empty space, were Elena and Lily. Elena had her hand on Lily's shoulder. Lily was pressed against her mother's side with a stillness that wasn't natural for her, the stillness of a child who has been frightened and is doing its best to manage it. She was looking at Roman with those eyes, his eyes, and the look on her face was not the uncomplicated joy of the ballroom. It was something else, something more specific. It was the look of a small person who has identified the one thing in the room she trusts and is waiting to see what that thing does. Roman looked at her for exactly 1 second. 1 second, because 1 second was what he could afford, and in that second he made his face do something deliberate. He made it say, "I see you. I'm here. Everything is going to be fine." He didn't know if a 5-year-old could read that. He had no data on what 5-year-olds could read. He looked at Carrera. "You came alone," Carrera said. He sounded faintly appreciative, the tone of a man who had expected to be surprised and wasn't. "I came with 2 men," Roman said. "Like you asked." "Yes." Carrera walked forward several steps, hands loose at his sides. He moved without urgency. "That's what I mean. Another man would have come with an army and made this into something that couldn't end well for anyone. You made a different choice." "I made the obvious choice." "You made a father's choice," Carrera said it without any particular inflection, stating a category. "That's new for you." Roman said nothing. He was tracking the room while appearing to look only at Carrera. 2 men near the left side door, positioned so they had angle on the nave. 1 man near the right door, partially behind a stone pillar. The 4th visible man was directly behind Carrera, which meant he was the one Carrera trusted most. Beyond the altar door, impossible to be certain, but the position of Carrera's body suggested awareness of something at his back that wasn't worry, which meant support. "You have something that belongs to me," Roman said. The building in Bridgeport, Carrera said. Yes, I assumed you'd found it. That's why we moved early this morning. He glanced toward Elena and Lily with the brief, assessing look of a man checking an investment. She's been very calm. Her mother. I appreciate that. She's had practice, Roman said. A pause. Something moved in Carrera's expression that might have been respect and might have been something colder. I don't want to hurt anyone here, Carrera said. I want you to understand that as a genuine statement, not a negotiating position. The child is, there are lines I don't cross. I have them. You have a child of your own, Roman said. Carrera's expression shifted. Not much. I had a son, he said. I know. Roman had read everything in the machine shop. He knew about the son. He knew about the circumstances. He'd been carrying that piece of information as a possible instrument since the car ride over. DeLuca organization, 12 years ago. He was running a route he shouldn't have been on. The room got very quiet. He was 23, Carrera said. The mildness in his voice had changed. Not gone, still present, still controlled, but the quality of it had changed. It was the kind of mild that sits over something enormous, the way ice sits over deep water. He was 23 years old and he made a mistake on a route, and the man in charge of that operation decided that a mistake warranted a permanent response. The man in charge of that operation was not me, Roman said. No. Carrera acknowledged this without altering the expression. It was your predecessor, the man you removed 2 years later. He paused. For other reasons. For other reasons, Roman confirmed. But you inherited the organization. You inherited its decisions, its debts. He tilted his head slightly. You understand debts, Mr. DeLuca. I'm told it's one of the things you're most particular about. Roman looked at him. He understood now. Not just the architecture of the conspiracy, but the foundation under it, the original stone it had been built on. 14 months of patient construction, a proxy war run through Marco and Danny Fitch, a frame built around Roman's own organization from the inside. All of it traced back to a 23-year-old on a route he shouldn't have been on 12 years ago, and a father who had spent a decade deciding what the appropriate response was. What do you want? Roman said. He said it without the flatness of the phone call. He said it like a real question. I want the organization, Carrera said simply. Not destroyed, transitioned. I want the supply lines, the port connections, the financial infrastructure. I want the families to recognize a change of leadership. Not violent, not public, just recognized. You walk away with your life and the people you care about, and enough resources that the walking away is comfortable. He spread his hands slightly. It's a reasonable offer. You spent 14 months building a case for a reasonable offer. I spent 14 months making sure you would have no alternative to a reasonable offer, Carrera said. There's a difference. Roman heard the side door on his left open. He didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on Carrera and tracked it in his peripheral vision. 2 more men coming in from outside, which meant the perimeter that Carrera had been maintaining was shifting, consolidating into the room, closing the space. He counted. 6 visible now, plus probable support behind the altar door. Nico and Reyes behind him. The math was not good math, but Caruso was outside. He needed 30 more seconds. You know about the documentation I pulled from Bridgeport, Roman said. Danny contacted me. Carrera's voice didn't change. Yes. Then you know that I can distribute everything in that building to every family in this city with one message. Everything. The forged letters, the financial manipulation, the communication records between you and Marco. All of it, simultaneously, to every party that has an interest in knowing how you've been conducting yourself for the last 14 months. You could do that, Carrera agreed. From where you're standing, with the phone in your pocket, you could send that message, and within 40 minutes, every family in Chicago would have a very comprehensive picture of my activities. He paused. And within 20 minutes of you sending that message, 3 things would happen. The first is that the men I have on your lieutenants would receive instructions that those lieutenants would not enjoy. The second is that certain financial assets, yours, accounts your organization depends on, would be frozen through a mechanism I've had in place for 6 months. The third is that the woman and child standing in this room would no longer be in a position to walk out of it. He said all of this with the same mildness. I'm not threatening, Mr. DeLuca. I'm explaining the landscape. Elena hadn't moved. Roman could see her from the edge of his vision, very still, hand on Lily's shoulder, her face controlled in the way of someone who is listening to everything and calculating and waiting for a signal. She had been doing that since the ballroom. She had been doing it every time he'd seen her in the last 18 hours. She was, he understood, considerably more capable than Carrera had accounted for. He just needed her to wait a few more seconds. He heard it before Carrera did. He heard it because he was listening for it, and Carrera wasn't. The specific sound of a door giving way, not the main door but the altar door behind Carrera, and the slight change in the air pressure of the room that meant more than one entrance had changed state simultaneously. Caruso had not waited for 11 o'clock. Everything happened in the same 3 seconds. The altar door blew inward and Caruso came through it with 2 men behind him, and at the same moment the right side door opened and 2 more of Roman's people came through, and Carrera's visible men moved the way trained men move, fast and lateral, going for cover, bringing weapons up. And Roman crossed the 12 feet between himself and Elena and Lily in a time he couldn't have measured because he wasn't tracking time. He was tracking distance, and he reached them and put himself between them and the room and said one word to Elena, "Down." She was already moving. She was already pulling Lily toward the floor, already turning her own body to cover the child's, already making herself small, and directed in a way that cost her nothing in terms of speed because she had decided what she was doing before he'd said anything. The man nearest to them, Carrera's man, the one who'd been behind the left pillar, came around the stone at a run. Nico hit him from the side and they went down together in a collision that was loud and ugly on the stone floor. Reyes was moving toward the altar end, toward Carrera, and one of Carrera's rear guards stepped out from behind the altar platform and fired once, and Reyes went down on his right side and rolled and kept moving, which meant it wasn't center mass, but it wasn't nothing either. Roman didn't have a clear shot at the rear guard from his position. He had Elena and Lily on the floor behind him, and 2 of Carrera's men between him and any angle on the altar end. He moved left. He moved toward the pillar that Nico had come from, using the stone column for cover, and he felt rather than saw Lily reach out and grab the hem of his jacket with both hands, the grip of a terrified child holding on to the only thing she'd decided was safe. And he reached back without looking and put his hand over hers for 1 second. 1 second, just the contact, just the information that he was still there. And then he took her hands off his jacket and folded them toward Elena and said, without looking, "Hold your mother." He heard Elena say, "I've got her. Go." He went. The 2 men between him and the altar end had separated to cover Caruso's advance, which meant the center of the room was briefly open. Roman took it. He moved through the column of pale light falling from the upper windows, and he was aware of the specific exposed quality of moving through open space in a room with armed men in it, the way your back feels when there's nothing behind it, and he didn't stop moving because stopping was worse. Carrera had backed toward the altar platform. He had a weapon, but hadn't fired it, which told Roman something about what Carrera was. A builder, not a fighter, a man who had spent a decade constructing a situation where he would never need to fire a weapon because other people would have already resolved the problem for him. He looked, for the first time since Roman had walked in, like a man who had encountered a variable he hadn't fully modeled. "This doesn't," Carrera started. "Stop talking," Roman said. He had closed the distance to 8 feet. "Put it down." Carrera's weapon was still up. His hand was steady, which Roman noted. The man was not physically afraid, whatever else was happening. "You can't win this cleanly," Carrera said. "Even if you take this room, you have Marco," Roman said, "who is currently in a room with 3 of my lawyers and a federal contact who has been interested in the De Luca organization for 4 years, and has been offered a significantly more interesting subject." He kept walking, 6 feet. "You have Danny Fitch, who gave a recorded statement at 2 a.m. this morning before I went to Bridgeport." 4 feet. "You have a communication record between yourself and 11 people across 6 families, that is, as of..." He checked nothing. He kept his eyes on Carrera. 4 minutes ago, in the possession of every one of those families simultaneously, because I told Caruso to send it when he came through the door. Carrera's face changed. "Your son deserved better than what happened to him," Roman said. He was 2 feet away now. "I mean that. It was wrong, and the man who ordered it answered for it eventually, though not for that specific thing, which I understand is not the same." He looked at Carrera directly. "But you built this on a dead man's debt, and you used a child to do it, and we're done." He put his hand on Carrera's weapon and pushed it down into the side with the flat authority of someone who has decided the conversation is over. Carrera let it go. Not because he'd given up. Roman could see that clearly. The man hadn't given up. He'd arrived at the same calculation Roman had arrived at earlier that morning, the one where you run all the scenarios and find the one where the most important thing survives. Carrera's most important thing was not the organization anymore. It was something else, something that the change in his expression had told Roman about the moment he'd said the word son. The families have the documentation, Carrera said. Quiet, stripped of the mildness now. Yes. Then it's done. It's done, Roman said. A long moment. The room around them was resolving. Caruso had his men on Carrera's remaining fighters, two of whom had stopped when they saw their employer lower the weapon. One of whom had needed more convincing and was now sitting against the wall breathing carefully with Nico standing over him. Reyes was on his feet, which was good. His right arm wasn't working right, which was less good but survivable. Roman turned away from Carrera and looked at the center of the room. Elena was on her feet. She had Lily against her chest, the little girl's arms around her neck, face buried in her mother's shoulder. Elena was standing in the middle of the old stone nave in the pale light from the upper windows, and she was looking at Roman with an expression he didn't have a name for, something that lived on the far side of fear and relief and anger, and something else, something that he thought might be the expression you make when you have finally stopped bracing for the thing you were bracing for. He walked toward them. He was aware of every step on the stone floor. He stopped in front of them. Lily's face appeared from Elena's shoulder. Her cheeks were wet and her nose was running and her hair had come out of one of the braids. And she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, in a very small voice, "You came." Something broke open in his chest. Not broke the way things break when they fail. Broke the way things break when they've been held too tight for too long and the pressure finally releases. "I came," he said. She reached for him. Both arms, the total physical commitment of a small child deciding something, and he took her without thinking about it, without deciding to, just the automatic response of a body that had apparently already figured out something his mind was still catching up to. She was lighter than he expected, and heavier than he expected simultaneously. She smelled like whatever shampoo Elena had used in the apartment that morning, and underneath it, very faint, the particular smell of a child who had been frightened and was coming back from it. She pressed her face against his neck and said nothing. He stood in the middle of the abandoned cathedral with his daughter in his arms, and looked at Elena over the top of Lily's dark head. Elena looked back at him. Her eyes were bright, which he'd learned meant something specific. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor for a moment, and when she looked up again she had herself in hand. "Reyes needs a hospital," she said, practical, grounded. She was looking at his right arm across the room. "I know." He didn't look away from her. "And Carrera?" "Taken care of." "Marco?" "Taken care of." She nodded, absorbed it. Then she did something he didn't expect. She reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, just briefly, just for a moment, palm against his jaw, and looked at him with something that was entirely unguarded and entirely real, and that lasted only a second before she took her hand back. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's get out of here." The next 6 hours were work. Roman was good at work. It was the thing he had always been best at, the sequencing, the managing, the application of control to complicated situations. And he threw himself into it because it was the one register where he knew exactly what to do. Reyes went to a private clinic on the north side, accompanied by one of Roman's men who handled the paperwork. The injury was a through and through on the outer upper arm, painful and costly in terms of recovery time, not life-threatening. Carrera's men were processed in the specific way that Roman's organization processed such things. Not through official channels, not violently, through a combination of confiscated phones, documented identities, and a very clear explanation of the terms under which they were being permitted to leave the building. 3 of them would be useful as witnesses if it came to that. The others were simply gone, sent in different directions with the understanding that the alternative to leaving quietly was not pleasant. Carrera himself was placed in a car and taken to a location that Roman's lawyers were already present at, along with the federal contact who had accepted Roman's offer. Not immunity, not cooperation, something more surgical than either. A transaction. The documentation from Bridgeport was the currency. Carrera was the merchandise. Marco Vitelli had been collected from his Lincoln Park townhouse at 6 a.m. by people Roman had sent before going to Bridgeport, and was currently occupying the same conversation with the same lawyers and the same federal contact from a different room. Marco had, by all reports, been considerably more cooperative than expected, which meant he had understood his position and calculated accordingly. Roman had mixed feelings about this. Compliance from Marco felt like one more manipulation. He filed it and moved on. By 2 in the afternoon, Roman was in a conference room in a building on Michigan Avenue that his organization owned through a legitimate holding company, sitting across from representatives of 4 families who had received the Bridgeport documentation that morning. He had expected resistance. He had expected at least one of them to attempt to use the chaos of the morning as leverage. What he got instead was something closer to relief. Carrera had been running the same type of patient, architectural pressure on 2 of the other families that he'd been running on Roman. Not the same approach. Carrera was sophisticated enough to tailor his methods. But the same foundation: debt, leverage, inside access, a slowly tightening frame. The documentation Roman had distributed didn't just expose what had been done to him. It exposed the full scope of Carrera's project, which was considerably larger than a single organization transition. The representative from the Benedetto family, not Benedetto himself, a careful man named Price, who was being careful in the particular way of someone who had recently discovered he'd been inside a game he didn't know the rules of, said, "He had a man inside us too." "I know," Roman said. "It's in the documentation." "For how long?" "8 months, in your case." Price sat with that. He had the look of a man revising a long series of decisions in light of new information. "The sedan last night, the one outside the hotel." "Carrera's," Roman said. He moved on the girl as soon as the ballroom made her existence public. He'd been waiting for leverage, and she provided it. Another representative, a woman named Chu, who controlled logistics interests on the south side, and who Roman had underestimated for years and was revising that now, said, "What do you want from this meeting?" Roman looked at her. "Recognition," he said, "of Lily as my heir. Public, formal, in the presence of everyone who needs to hear it." He paused. "The rumors about the DeLuca succession have been destabilizing. I want them resolved." Chu looked at him for a moment. She was about 50, with the specific composure of someone who had survived in a room of men for a long time by being better at the game than they were and never letting them notice. "The child is 5 years old," she said. "Yes." "She's not taking over anything for a long time." "No, but she exists. She's mine, and the fact of that needs to be on the table instead of under it." Chu looked at Price. Price looked at the other 2. Something passed between them in the way that things pass between people who have been in the same rooms for long enough that they can communicate in shorthand. "Fine," Chu said. "We can do that." Roman nodded. He had expected it to be harder. He filed the ease of it under Carrera, did more damage to the other families than they want to admit, and moved on. He was out of the building by 4:30. He drove back to the apartment on the near north side. He let himself in with the key Nico had given him that morning. The apartment was quiet. Elena was on the couch with a book she wasn't reading, her legs tucked under her, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting and is managing the waiting with varying levels of success. Lily was asleep again. He could see her through the open bedroom door, sprawled sideways across the bed, in the boneless way of a child who has expended everything and gone horizontal as a consequence. Roman sat down in the chair across from Elena. He felt, for the first time since the Marchetti ballroom, the full weight of the last 22 hours. It settled on him all at once, the way exhaustion does when you've been running on adrenaline and the adrenaline finally decides it's done. "How did it go?" Elena said. He told her. The conference room, Price and Chu, the recognition, all of it in the same short, accurate way he'd been telling her things. Not the version for public consumption, not the version that made him look in control of everything, just the actual sequence of events. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "They recognized her," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She looked at the ceiling. She took a slow breath and let it out. "What does that mean for her?" Elena said. "Practically, long term." "It means she's protected," Roman said, "by every organization that was in that room today. It also means..." He paused. He wanted to get this right. It means she has a name, a real one, not one we have to hide. Elena looked at him. The bright quality was back in her eyes. I'm not going to push, Roman said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm not asking you to. He stopped, found the sentence. I know what we lost. I know 5 years isn't something I can fix by being right about Marco. I know you built a life and I'm not asking you to dismantle it. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking to be part of whatever comes next, whatever that looks like, whatever pace you need. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing something specific to the Chicago skyline, the particular gold that happened in March when the sun got low early and hit the glass buildings at an angle that made the whole city look briefly like it was on fire. She asked me this afternoon, Elena said quietly, if you were going to be her daddy now. She looked at him. For real. That's how she phrased it. For real. Roman's chest did the thing again. He was getting more familiar with it. He still didn't have a name for it. What did you tell her? He said. Elena looked at him for a long moment with that fully unguarded expression that she kept allowing him and then taking back. And this time she didn't take it back. I told her to ask you herself, she said. And from the bedroom, in the drowsy, not quite awake voice of a child surfacing from a very deep sleep, a small voice said, Daddy? Roman looked at the doorway. He stood up from the chair, and the full weight of the last 22 hours was still on him, and the question of what came next was still entirely open, and there were 100 things unresolved and 100 more that would need to be built from nothing. And he crossed to the bedroom doorway and looked at the small person on the bed who was looking back at him with his own eyes. Yeah, he said, I'm here. Lily sat up and extended her arms with the absolute simplicity of a child who has made a decision and is waiting for the world to cooperate. Roman DeLuca, who had survived 15 years of the worst that this city could put in front of a man who had built an empire on fear and maintained it on control, and never once flinched from anything it cost him, crossed the room and picked up his daughter, and the sound she made when he did, the small, contented exhale of a child who has arrived exactly where she intended to be, was the most devastating thing he had ever heard in his life. Behind him, in the doorway, Elena was watching, and for the first time in 5 years she did not look away. The first week was the hardest, not because of the danger. The danger had a shape now, and Roman knew how to work with shaped things. It was hard because of the ordinary hours, the ones between the operational tasks, the ones where there was nothing to manage and nothing to sequence, and the apartment on the near north side was simply a place where 3 people existed in proximity to each other without the specific glue of crisis holding them together. Lily adapted immediately. Children adapted the way water moved, finding the available space and filling it without deliberation. By the second morning, she had claimed the left side of the kitchen counter for her drawings, a spreading archive of crayon work that depicted, as far as Roman could interpret, a family of 3 stick figures in various outdoor settings. The tallest figure wore what appeared to be a very serious expression in every drawing. Roman did not comment on this. Elena adapted slowly, which was honest. She didn't pretend the apartment was comfortable when it wasn't. She didn't perform ease for his benefit or for Lily's. She made coffee in the morning with the focused attention of someone who needs the ritual, and she sat at the kitchen table with it and looked out the window, and Roman learned not to fill that silence because it wasn't the kind of silence that wanted filling. He learned things that week. Small things, accumulated without announcement. Lily needed 2 glasses of water before bed and would negotiate for a third. Elena slept lightly and woke at any sound from the bedroom, a vigilance so habituated she wasn't aware of it. Lily had a specific laugh, not the bright social laugh she deployed for effect, but the real one, sudden and slightly ungainly, that only happened when something genuinely surprised her. He heard it 3 times that first week, and each time it did something to the room that he couldn't quantify. He slept on the couch. He didn't offer to do otherwise, and Elena didn't suggest it. The distance was a fact they both understood without discussing it. Marco Vitelli's formal cooperation began on day 4. The federal contact, a woman named Salas who had been trying to find a way into organized financial networks for 6 years, and who approached the Bridgeport documentation with the focused joy of someone who had been handed exactly what they'd been looking for, structured it as a long-form deposition rather than a standard interview. Marco sat in a room for 11 hours over 2 days and talked. Roman received summaries, but not transcripts, which was intentional. He didn't want the transcripts. He didn't want to sit in a room with Marco's voice for any longer than the situation required of him. What the summaries confirmed, the operation against Roman had begun not 14 months ago, but 22. The relationship between Marco and Carrera predated the Marchetti wedding by nearly 2 years. The forged letter to Elena had been Carrera's concept and Marco's execution. Carrera had understood that Roman's attention was divided, and had calculated that removing the source of the division was more elegant than confronting the distraction directly. The stationery had been taken from Roman's office over a period of 3 visits, a sheet at a time, so that the absence would be undetectable. The signature had been practiced on paper that was subsequently burned. Danny Fitch had been recruited separately, later, as a surveillance mechanism to track whether Roman was showing signs of rebuilding, whether he'd found another reason to be human in the intervening years. He hadn't. Roman sat with that piece of information for a while. For 5 years, Marco and Carrera had been monitoring him for signs that he might become again the man he'd briefly been. And for 5 years there had been nothing to monitor because Roman had done a thorough job of becoming exactly the machine they needed him to be. He found this both clarifying and bleak in equal measure. Carrera's cooperation was more complicated. The federal arrangement gave him a narrow path, not immunity, not freedom, but a ceiling on consequences that was lower than it would otherwise have been, in exchange for the full scope of his network across 6 cities. He gave it with the same mildness he'd given everything, with the focused practicality of a man who had done his accounting and found the number he could live with. Roman was not present for any of it. He didn't want to be. What he wanted was to know it was done. On the evening of the 6th day, Salas called him directly and said, in the precise, efficient language of someone who communicated for a living, "The structure has been sufficiently documented. You can consider the matter closed." Roman said thank you and ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the apartment and looked at the drawings on the counter for a long moment. Closed. The word sat in the room like something that had been carried a very long distance and set down. He told Elena that night. Lily was asleep. Elena was on the couch with her legs tucked under her in the position he'd come to recognize as her default resting configuration, and she was looking at nothing in particular in the way of someone whose mind was somewhere more active than the room. He sat in the chair. He told her what Salas had said. He told her about Marco's cooperation, what the summaries had confirmed about the timeline and the mechanics of what had been done. He told her about the stationery, taken a sheet at a time. He told her about Danny Fitch monitoring for signs of human feeling in the years after. She listened to all of it. She was very still. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. He could hear the building around them, the particular urban quiet of a Chicago night, traffic faint and distant, a radiator somewhere down the hall doing its imperfect work. 22 months, she said finally. Yes. They were planning it before you even knew I was pregnant. Yes. He kept his voice even. It wasn't about you specifically. Not initially. Carrera wanted the organization. Marco wanted to consolidate. You were... He stopped. Found the sentence that was true rather than careful. You were the reason I might have made different choices. That's what they were removing. Elena looked at the middle distance. Her jaw was set. He watched you for 5 years, she said. Making sure you didn't... She stopped. Making sure I stayed useful, Roman said. Productive. Appropriately hungry. She made the sound again. The one that lived between anger and grief with no name for the territory between them. And you were. I was, he said. No hedging. It was true, and he owned it. You built the whole empire in those 5 years, she said. Not an accusation, just a fact, laid on the table between them. I did. Because there was nothing else. He looked at her steadily. Yes. Another long silence. She looked at him with an expression he'd been learning to read, the full weight one, the one she allowed sometimes now for longer than a second before she took it back. She let it stay longer than she usually did. I moved 6 times in 5 years, she said quietly. I got a new phone every 18 months. I made friends carefully, and I kept them at a specific distance, and I told Lily her father was someone she'd understand when she was older. She paused. I kept telling myself it was okay, that we were fine, that we had everything we needed. Her voice didn't waver. But I kept the letter. I kept it in the inner pocket of every suitcase. Every time I moved, I transferred it to the new suitcase. I told myself it was evidence in case I ever needed it. Roman said nothing. It wasn't evidence, she said. I just couldn't get rid of his handwriting on the outside. The room was very quiet. Roman got up from the chair and sat on the couch beside her. Not close, not reaching for anything. Just moved to the same level as her, the same piece of furniture, and sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. For what specifically? For building something that made me worth manipulating, he said. For becoming something that someone could use against you. He paused. For not... I had the resources to find you. For 3 months I looked, and then I stopped, because Marco told me you'd chosen to go, and I believed him. I should have kept looking. I should have gone myself instead of sending people. I should have... Roman, she said his name with a specific weight. Stop. He stopped. You couldn't have known, she said. He was inside your operation for 11 years. You trusted him. That was the reasonable thing to do. She looked at her hands in her lap. I believed the letter. I believed your signature. I ran with my daughter before she was born because I thought the man I... She stopped. Restarted. Because I thought you'd made a specific, clear choice. I didn't question it. That was the reasonable thing to do. She looked up. Neither of us was stupid. We were just operated on by someone who was patient and knew where the pressure points were. He looked at her. The lamp in the corner of the room put a specific quality of light on her face that he was going to remember. She looks like you, Elena said suddenly. People always tell me she has my stubbornness, but the way she looks at things, the way she decides something and just commits to it completely, no second guessing. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's entirely you. Is that an insult? He said. No, she said, and she almost smiled, not quite, but the shape of it was there at the corner of her mouth, and it was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her in 7 days, and it hit him harder than it probably should have. What do you want to do? He said. About all of it, going forward. I'm not asking for a decision tonight. I'm asking what you actually want. She was quiet for a moment. The not-quite smile was gone. She was serious again, working something through. I want to go home, she said. My apartment, my job, Lily's school. She looked at him. I want her to know who you are. I want her to have... She deserves to have you in her life, Roman. She's known you for a week and she's already rearranged herself around you like you were always there. Her voice had something in it that was precise and sad and clear all at once. She's going to be devastated every time you leave. Then I'll come to her, he said. It's not that simple. I know. He held her gaze. Nothing about what we're building is going to be simple. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for the chance to show up. He paused. Consistently. For as long as you'll let me. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The lamp, the quiet building, the distant city. Okay, she said. Quiet. Waited. The same word she'd used in the hotel room 7 days ago, with the same quality of something that had been held back finally being released. Neither of them said anything else that night, but when Roman went back to the couch 2 hours later, Elena was still sitting where she'd been, and she watched him go with an expression that was not as closed as it had been a week ago. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and counted that as something. Bets. The weeks after that were construction. Not the dramatic kind, but not the kind with a shape and a sequence and a clear endpoint, the kind that is mostly showing up and being consistent and learning the specific weight of things you didn't know mattered. He learned the weight of a Tuesday, the particular texture of a school pickup, Lily emerging from the building in a rush of movement and noise, always talking before she reached him, recounting the day in the non-linear way of children for whom temporal sequence is secondary to emotional significance. He learned that her teacher's name was Ms. Petrova and was referred to with great respect. He learned that there was a boy named Jake who was frequently discussed with the complex ambivalence of someone who is both annoying and important. He learned that the walk from the school to the parking structure took 11 minutes if Lily was in an efficient mood and 23 if she decided the cracks in the sidewalk required avoidance. He learned to drive the route without thinking about it, He learned it the way you learn things that matter, not deliberately, but through repetition, until the knowledge lives in your body rather than your head. He was in Chicago 3 days a week at minimum, sometimes 4. He kept the apartment on the near north side, and he did not pressure Elena about anything related to it. She went back to her own place, her own life, the job she'd built in the city she'd chosen, and they negotiated a schedule with the careful practicality of two people who were building something neither of them had a blueprint for. He watched her become more comfortable. Not dramatically, not in moments he could point to. It was the accumulation of small things. The way she stopped tensing slightly when he came through the door. The way she started having coffee ready when he arrived on Tuesday mornings. The way she let him sit beside her on the couch sometimes without shifting to the other end. He did not rush any of it. He had spent 15 years running on the principle that you pushed until the thing moved, and he understood that this was a thing that would not respond to pressure. He had watched Elena in the cathedral, on the floor with Lily, covering the child with her own body without a second's hesitation, and he understood something precise about her. She was a woman who had decided what mattered and was protecting it. He was not going to push his way into the category of things that mattered. He was going to earn it. Some days that was hard. He was not by nature a patient man. He worked on it. That was new too. Working on something about himself, not because it was operationally necessary, but because someone else's comfort required it. 3 months in, he sat across from Elena at a restaurant they'd been to twice before, a place on the north side that had good food and enough ambient noise that conversation felt private, and he said something he'd been building toward for weeks. "I want to change the organization," he said. She looked up from her menu. "How?" "The structure, the way it operates." He set down his own menu. "What I've been running, it works because it's built on a specific kind of fear. People comply because the consequence of not complying is worse than complying. That works right up until the moment someone decides the consequence is worth it, and then you have Marco." He paused. "Carrera was right about one thing. I was losing focus that year. I had started to want something that didn't fit what I'd built. And what I'd built couldn't accommodate it, so it pushed back." Elena set her menu down. She was listening with the full attention that she'd always given him, the quality that had always made him feel, slightly uncomfortably, like he was being accurately perceived. "What does changing it look like?" she said. "Slower," he said. "More careful. Replacing the fear-based infrastructure with something that runs on loyalty instead, which takes longer to build and is less immediately responsive, but doesn't produce Marco Vitellis." He looked at her. "It's going to take years. The families that recognize Lily, I've had 3 conversations with them in the last month about what this looks like as a model. Chu is interested. Price is cautious, but not opposed." "You're talking about restructuring how organized crime works in this city," she said. "I'm talking about restructuring how I work in this city," he said. "What other people do is their choice." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me?" "Because I want you to know who I'm trying to become," he said. "Not what I've been. Not what I was when we met, which was," he paused, "honest. Not something I'm proud of in every respect. Who I'm trying to be now." He met her eyes. "I want you to have accurate information." Elena was quiet. Outside the restaurant window, Chicago moved past in its indifferent and illuminated way. "You've been coming every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 months," she said. "You've never been late. You've never canceled. You rearranged a meeting with Price to make it to Lily's school thing about the solar system." She tilted her head slightly. "She made you a paper planet, Saturn. She gave it to you in the parking lot, and you put it on your dashboard." He did not confirm or deny the Saturn thing. "I know what I've been doing." "I know you know." She looked at him. "I'm telling you that I've been watching, and I'm telling you that it's counted. What you've been doing, it's counted." He held her gaze. The restaurant moved around them with its noise and its warmth and its ordinary human business. "Elena," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and this time she didn't take it back after a second. She left it there, warm and deliberate, and looked at him with an expression that was not the heavily guarded one and not the fully unguarded one, but something new. Something that existed in the space between those two positions that had been opening up gradually for 3 months and was now just open. He turned his hand under hers and held it. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. The wedding was in June, not theirs. Sofia Marchetti's younger brother, a quiet man named Paul who had been dating the same woman for 9 years, and had finally committed to the occasion with what appeared to be enormous relief. The venue was a garden space on the North Shore, outdoor, open, the lake visible in the distance, everything green and warm and completely unlike the Drexel Grand's 40-foot ceilings and political calculations. Roman had been invited because the Marchetti family had extended the invitation before the events of March, which he appreciated for its simplicity. Elena had been invited because Sofia had maintained the friendship through everything, with the uncomplicated loyalty of a woman who had decided her college roommate mattered and had not revised that decision. They arrived together. This was new enough that it had a specific quality, not heavy, not fraught, just new in the way of things that haven't yet accumulated enough repetition to feel inevitable. He was aware of the people near the entrance who registered their arrival with the specific attentiveness of rooms that had heard things, and he was aware that Elena was aware of them too. And he was aware that neither of them adjusted anything about how they were walking because of it. Lily was between them, holding both their hands. She had insisted on this configuration from the parking area and had arranged it with her characteristic absence of negotiation, simply placed herself between them and taken a hand from each, and looked up at both of them with the expression of someone who has solved a logistical problem and is satisfied with the solution. She was wearing a yellow dress that Elena had let her choose herself, which explained the yellow. She had agreed to 2 braids, which was already a concession. The braids were even this time. Roman had learned to do them in February, sitting on the floor of Lily's room with a YouTube tutorial running on mute on his phone, which was possibly the most humbling 40 minutes of his adult life, and also not something he had any interest in undoing. They walked into the garden, and the light was gold and easy, the particular light of a June afternoon in Chicago, when the city remembers it can be generous. The tables were set with simple flowers, real ones, nothing that tried too hard. The guests were a smaller crowd than the Marchetti wedding in January. People who actually knew Paul and his bride rather than people who needed to be there for reasons of political alignment. Roman recognized a few faces. Price was there. He nodded once, a specific acknowledgement that carried more weight than a wave. Chu was not present but had sent a gift, which had arrived at Roman's office 2 days ago with a card in her precise handwriting that said simply, "Appropriate that it starts here and ends better." He had read it twice before understanding what she meant, and then set it on his desk where he could see it. Sofia appeared immediately when she spotted Elena, the particular velocity of a woman who has been wanting to say things and has finally arrived at the moment where saying them is possible. She embraced Elena with the full-body conviction of genuine feeling and said something into her hair that Roman couldn't hear and that he understood wasn't for him. Lily submitted to being hugged by Sofia with patient tolerance. Then she turned and looked up at Roman with the air of someone confirming a situation. "Can I go look at the flowers?" she said. "Stay where I can see you," he said. She went immediately, with the purposeful stride of a small person who has been given parameters and found them acceptable. Roman watched her cross the grass toward the flower arrangements at the edge of the tent, already reaching out to touch petals, already in conversation with herself or possibly with the flowers. He had learned not to ask which. Elena appeared at his shoulder. Sofia had been redirected by a relative somewhere behind them. "She's going to try to pick one," Elena said. "I know." "She'll say it fell." "I know." They stood side by side and watched Lily examine a white arrangement with the focused intensity of a botanist or a thief. The lake was visible past the tent's open edge, blue-gray and enormous, doing nothing in particular. "I never thought I'd be back in a room like this," Elena said quietly. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching Lily. "After January. I spent the whole drive home from the Marchetti wedding telling myself it was fine, it was a coincidence, I'd never see you again." "Was that what you wanted?" A pause. Long enough to be an honest answer. "I don't know what I wanted," she said. "I know what I told myself I wanted." She looked at him sideways. "Those are usually different things." He looked at her. The gold afternoon light. Her hair down, loose, the way she'd started wearing it more often in the last month, which he had noticed and said nothing about because he was learning which things to say and which things to simply register. "Are you glad," he said, "that it wasn't a coincidence?" She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression had the quality of a door that had been standing ajar for a long time and was now, finally, simply open. Yes, she said. She said it the way he'd said yes in the kitchen 3 months ago, without condition. He reached out and took her hand. She let him and folded her fingers through his, and they stood like that in the June light with their daughter 20 feet away, negotiating with a flower arrangement and the lake behind it all doing its massive, indifferent, somehow comforting work. Lily looked back at them from the flowers. She registered their joined hands with the immediate attention of a child who tracks changes in the state of things and finds most of them interesting. Her face did something specific, a kind of satisfied assessment, like a small person who had expected a particular outcome and is pleased to find it has arrived. She turned back to the flowers. Roman looked at the top of her head, the two even braids, and felt something that had no name and needed none. Elena's thumb moved slightly against his hand. Just once. Just the pressure of it. There were no enemies left in the room. There were no calculations running, no angles to track, no rooms within rooms. There was only a garden on a June afternoon in a city that could be generous when it tried, and a woman standing beside him who had chosen to be there, and a 5-year-old in a yellow dress conducting an investigation of flowers with the dedication of someone who intends to come away with at least one. The things that had been lost were lost. 5 years that hadn't happened. A letter that should never have existed. All the ordinary mornings and unremarkable evenings and small specific moments that should have accumulated into a life and hadn't, not yet, and couldn't be recovered by any means Roman had available to him. He had stopped trying to recover them. He had started trying to be present in the ones that were actually occurring, which was harder than it sounded for a man who had spent 15 years everywhere except the present moment. He was getting better at it. Lily detached herself from the flower arrangement and came back across the grass toward them at a run, both braids bouncing, yellow dress catching the light. She arrived at speed and inserted herself between them with her characteristic absence of ceremony, taking a hand from each, and looked up first at her mother and then at her father with the expression of someone who has found everything in the correct location and is prepared to proceed. "Can we eat?" she said. "I'm very hungry." "You had lunch an hour ago," Elena said. "That was a long time ago," Lily said. Roman looked at Elena. Elena looked at Roman. "She's not wrong," he said. Elena made the sound that was almost a laugh and actually was one, full this time, the real one, and it moved through the June afternoon like something that had been waiting to happen and had finally found its moment. They walked toward the tables, the three of them, Lily between them holding both their hands, and the lake was behind them, and the city was somewhere beyond the trees, and the light was doing what good light does when it finds the right moment, simply illuminating, without comment, what is actually there. Everything that had tried to destroy them was finished. Everything that had been hidden was now in the open. Every lie had been named, and every name had been given to the people who needed to hear it, and what was left when all of that had been cleared away was this. A garden, a June afternoon, a child who knew exactly where she was, and two people who had been separated by design and had found each other anyway. Not because fate had arranged it, because a 5-year-old had seen something true across a crowded ballroom and had run toward it without hesitation, and had been, in that one uncomplicated moment, smarter than every careful, calculating adult in the room. Lily pulled both their hands forward toward the tables, toward the food, toward whatever came next. They went.